The challenge, the morning sun beat down mercilessly on the training compound in Bahrain, where elite forces from across the Middle East had gathered for joint exercises. Captain Nur al-Mansouri adjusted her tactical vest, ignoring the familiar ache that spread across her left shoulder and down her arm. The scar tissue beneath her uniform pulled tight with each movement, a constant reminder of the price she had paid for her service. Listen up. Commander Marcus Steele Harrison's voice cut through the desert air like a blade. The American Navy SEAL had a reputation that preceded him in compromising, brilliant and utterly intolerant of what he perceived as weakness. His steel-gray eyes swept over the assembled officers from Jordan, UAE, Kuwait, and other allied nations. Today's exercise will separate the wheat from the chaff. No excuses, no modifications, no special treatment. Nur straightened her shoulders, feeling the familiar twinge of nerve damage that radiated down her spine. She had faced men like Harrison before, those who saw her hijab, her slight frame, her gender, and immediately dismissed her capabilities. What they couldn't see were the commendations, the successful operations, the lives she had saved. She said, stepping forward with measured confidence. I need to request a modification for the rope climbing exercise. I have some mobility limitations due to previous injuries that save it. Captain Harrison interrupted with a dismissive wave. I've heard every excuse in the book. Bad back, old knee injury, didn't get enough sleep. His voice dripped with sarcasm as several American SEALs chuckled behind him. Maybe the Jordanian military has lower standards, but here we don't coddle officers who can't keep up. The silence that followed was deafening. Nur felt the eyes of every soldier on the field watching, waiting to see if she would back down or push back. Some of her fellow officers shifted uncomfortably. Knowing her reputation, but understanding the impossible position she had been placed in. Without a word, Nur reached for the sleeve of her tactical shirt. The fabric was specially designed to accommodate her scars, and she rolled it up slowly, deliberately. The morning light revealed a landscape of damaged flesh shrapnel scars that spiderwebbed across her forearm like silver lightning. Disappearing beneath her rolled sleeve, but clearly continuing much further, the training ground fell completely silent. Harrison's expression shifted from arrogance to shock, then to something approaching shame. These weren't the neat, surgical scars of an elective procedure or the thin lines of an accident. These were combat wounds, the kind that came from being too close to an explosion. The kind that left permanent damage. IED in Syria. 3 years ago, Nur said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the stillness. 17 pieces of shrapnel, 2 collapsed vertebrae, and 4 months of reconstruction surgery. She rolled her sleeve back down with the same careful precision. The nerve damage affects my grip strength above shoulder height. I can complete every other exercise at full capacity. Harrison opened his mouth, then closed it again. Across the field, Nur caught sight of a familiar figure, Sergeant Omar Khalil, from her own unit. Watching with an expression of quiet pride mixed with protective anger, he had been there that day in Syria. He had pulled her from the burning wreckage when everyone else thought she was lost. Captain. Harrison began, but Nur was already walking toward the modified exercise station. No apology necessary. Sir, she said over her shoulder. Just point me toward what needs to be done. The mission 3 years earlier, Surath. The desert highway stretched endlessly before the convoy. Heat waves creating mirages that danced on the horizon. Captain Nur al-Mansouri checked her equipment one final time as their armored vehicle bounced over the rough terrain. This was her first joint operation with international forces, and she was determined to prove that Jordan's Special Operations Command belonged among the world's elite. 2 clicks to target, came the voice through her headset. She glanced across the vehicle at the American sergeant who had introduced himself simply as Omar. He was different from the others, quieter, more thoughtful, with intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take in everything, while his teammates had initially greeted her with polite skepticism. Omar had simply nodded and asked about her experience with urban warfare. You've done ops like this before? He asked now, checking his rifle for the 3rd time. Amman Zarqa. Some classified locations, Nur replied, appreciating that he was asking about her expertise, not questioning her presence. You too many to count? Omar's expression was serious but not grim. Different country, same enemy. They adapt, we adapt. The explosion came without warning. One moment they were discussing tactical approaches. The next, the world erupted in fire and twisted metal. The IED had been expertly placed and perfectly timed. Their vehicle flipped twice before slamming into a concrete barrier. The reinforced hull cracking like an eggshell. Nur's world became a kaleidoscope of pain and confusion. Something warm and wet ran down her face blood from a head wound. Her left arm felt wrong, like it belonged to someone else. Through the ringing in her ears, she could hear shouting, gunfire, and the ominous hiss of escaping fuel. Nur. Nur, can you hear me? Omar's voice cut through the chaos. She tried to respond, but could only manage a weak cough. Smoke was filling the cabin, and she could smell gasoline. Her tactical vest had caught on something twisted metal that held her pinned in place. The vehicle's gonna blow? Someone shouted from outside. We need to move now. Not without her. Omar's voice was firm. Closer now. Through her blurred vision, she could see him working frantically to free her from the wreckage. His hands were already bloody from the jagged metal, but he didn't stop. Sergeant, that's an order. Fall back to the rally point. Copy that, sir. In about 2 minutes, Omar's voice held no room for argument as he continued working. A piece of shrapnel had pierced completely through her left shoulder, pinning her to the seat. Nur, this is going to hurt, but I need you to stay with me. She managed a nod, gritting her teeth as Omar carefully worked the metal fragment free. Pain exploded through her nervous system, but she bit back the scream. Around them, the vehicle creaked ominously, and the smell of fuel grew stronger. That's it, you're loose, Omar said, his voice gentle, despite the urgency. But I need you to move now. Can you do that? Nur tried to stand, but her left leg buckled immediately. Looking down, she could see her tactical pants were soaked with blood, more shrapnel embedded in her thigh and calf. I can't. My leg. Without hesitation, Omar scooped her up in his arms, cradling her against his chest as he maneuvered through the twisted wreckage. Each movement sent fresh waves of agony through her body, but his steady presence kept her conscious. Almost there, he murmured, his voice strained from her weight and the smoke. Just hold on. He cleared the vehicle with seconds to spare. The explosion that followed lit up the desert sky like a second sun. It's a shockwave, throwing them both to the ground 10 meters away. Omar's body covered hers protectively, taking the brunt of the debris that rained down around them. When the world finally stopped spinning, Nur found herself looking up into Omar's concerned eyes. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead, and his uniform was torn and scorched. But he was smiling. Welcome to the club nobody wants to join, he said softly, his hand finding hers. But we're alive, and that's what matters. As the medical evacuation helicopter approached in the distance, Nur squeezed his fingers weakly. She didn't know then that this moment would change everything, that the man who had refused to leave. Her behind would become the constant in her life, the one who would help her rebuild not just her body, but her faith in herself. The Rehabilitation Center in Amman was a place where careers came to die, or so the other patients whispered. Nur had been there for 6 weeks, enduring painful physical therapy sessions that left her exhausted and frustrated. The doctors spoke in careful, measured tones about realistic expectations and alternative career paths. What they meant was that her days as a special forces operator were likely over. You're pushing too hard again, Omar said quietly from the corner of the therapy room. He had taken leave to be there, claiming he needed to recover from his own injuries, though his wounds had healed weeks ago. The truth was simpler and more complicated. He couldn't bear to see her struggle alone. I need to get my strength back, Nur replied through gritted teeth, attempting another assisted pull-up. The nerve damage in her left shoulder sent electric jolts down her arm, but she refused to quit. Sweat beaded on her forehead beneath her hijab. She fought against her body's limitations. Omar stood and walked over to the therapy equipment. Mind if I work in? The physical therapist, Dr. Yasmin, looked between them uncertainly. Omar had been coming to these sessions for 3 weeks. Always respectful, always supportive, but never interfering with Nur's treatment. Today felt different. What are you doing? Nur asked as Omar positioned himself beside her. Being your partner, he said simply, beginning his own set of exercises at a pace that matched hers. We train together. We recover together. Over the following weeks, their rehabilitation became a dance of mutual support. When Nur struggled with grip strength exercises, Omar developed modified techniques they could practice together. When the pain became overwhelming and she wanted to quit, he was there with quiet encouragement and shared silence. The medical board is meeting next week, Nur confided one evening as they sat in the center's garden. The sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and purple, and for a moment, they could forget about surgeries and limitations and uncertain futures. What will you tell them? Omar asked, his voice carefully neutral. I'm ready to return to active duty. She flexed her left hand, watching the slight tremor that still affected her fine motor control. Even if I'm not sure I believe it myself. Omar was quiet for a long moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded paper. I've been meaning to show you this. It was a commendation letter, signed by their commanding officers from 3 different countries. The operation that had nearly killed them had also saved 17 hostages and neutralized a major terrorist cell. Her actions in the field, both before and after the explosion, had been exemplary. They want to reassign you to training command, Omar continued. Safe, predictable, away from the action. Nur's jaw tightened. A desk job. A leadership position, he corrected gently. But not what you want. What I want is to do my job. To serve my country the way I trained to do. She looked down at her scarred hands. But what if they're right? What if I'm not the same person I was before? Omar turned to face her fully, his expression intense. You're not the same person. You're stronger. You've seen your worst moment and survived it. You've rebuilt yourself from nothing. The woman sitting next to me is not weaker than the one who went into Syria, she's proven. You really believe that? I know it. And when you walk into that medical board, you'll know it too. The night before the hearing, Nur couldn't sleep. She found Omar in the hospital's small chapel, a non-denominational space where patients of all faiths could find peace. He was sitting in quiet contemplation, still wearing his civilian clothes from visiting hours. Couldn't sleep either? She asked, settling beside him. Thinking about tomorrow, he admitted. About what comes next. For me or for us? The question hung in the air between them. They had never defined what they were to each other. Comrades, friends, something more. The intensity of shared trauma and recovery had created a bond that transcended normal categories. Both, Omar said finally, I've put in for a transfer request. To wherever you're assigned next. Omar. Nur began, but he held up a hand. I'm not following you out of pity or obligation, he said firmly. I'm following you because you make me a better soldier, a better person. Because when I think about the future, I can't imagine it without you in it. Nur felt something shift inside her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with her injuries or her fears about tomorrow. For the first time in months, she felt truly ready to face whatever came next. The Testone, year later, Jordan Valley, the hostage situation had developed rapidly. Intelligence indicated that 12 civilians, including 3 children, were being held in a compound near the Syrian border. The terrorists were well-armed, well-trained, and had already executed one hostage to demonstrate their resolve. Command needed their best team for the rescue operation. Captain Nur al-Mansouri checked her equipment one final time as the helicopter approached the drop zone. Her left shoulder ached in the cold Predon air, but her grip was steady, her focus absolute. The medical board had cleared her for active duty 8 months ago. But this would be her first high-stakes operation since Syria. 2 minutes to insertion, Sergeant Omar Halil's voice came through her headset. He had indeed followed her to the new assignment, and they had spent months training together, rebuilding not just her physical capabilities, but their tactical partnership. What they had discovered was that their shared experience had created an almost telepathic understanding between them. Team Alpha, you have the north approach, came the mission commander's voice. Bravo team takes the south. Remember, civilian safety is priority 1. Nur and Omar were paired together in Alpha Team, along with 4 other operators. As they rappelled from the helicopter into the rocky terrain, Nur felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that meant she was exactly where she belonged. The doubts that had plagued her recovery seemed like distant memories. They moved through the darkness with practiced silence, communicating through hand signals and shared instinct. When they reached their position overlooking the compound, Omar touched her shoulder briefly, their signal for ready when you are. The gesture was professional, but the warmth behind it spoke of everything they meant to each other. I have eyes on 2 guards. Northeast corner, Nur whispered into her radio, adjusting her scope. They're rotating every 8 minutes. Copy that, Alpha 2, came the reply. Wait for my signal. The assault began with synchronized precision. Alpha Team neutralized the external guards while Bravo breached the main building. Nur moved with fluid efficiency, her months of rehabilitation paying off as she cleared rooms and covered angles with the same skill that had made her. Reputation? Then everything went wrong. Intelligence had been incomplete. There were more hostiles than expected, and they were better positioned. Omar's team came under heavy fire in the compound's central courtyard, pinned down by automatic weapons fire from multiple angles. Alpha 2, I need you to take the sniper position on the roof, the commander's voice crackled through the radio. It's the only angle that can provide overwatch for the extraction. Nur looked at the building and questioned a 3-story structure that would require climbing external pipes and ledges to reach. Her left shoulder would be stressed beyond anything she had attempted since her injury. But Omar and his team were trapped below, and civilians were dying. Copy that. Moving to position, she handed off her primary weapon to another team member and began the climb. Each pull-up sent fire through her damaged nerves. But she forced herself to focus on technique, on breathing, on the lives depending on her success. Halfway up, her left hand began to shake uncontrollably from the strain. You're not the same person. You're stronger. When she reached the roof, Nur quickly set up her rifle and began acquiring targets. From her elevated position, she could see the entire tactical situation hostiles moving to flank Omar's position. Civilians huddled in a basement room, escape routes that the ground team couldn't identify from their perspective. Alpha leader. You have 3 tangos moving to your 6 o'clock, she reported, her voice steady despite the pain. Recommend you move to the blue building, southeast corner. Negative Alpha 2. Too much open ground. Trust me, Nur said quietly. I've got you covered. What followed was the longest 3 minutes of her life. As Omar's team moved across the courtyard, Nur provided precise, methodical covering fire. Her left hand cramped and shook, but her right remained steady on the trigger. Each shot had to count. There were civilians everywhere, and the margin for error was 0. When the last hostile was down and the civilians were secure, Nur allowed herself to collapse against the roof's edge, her body shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. Below, she could see Omar helping to evacuate the rescued hostages, his movements efficient and calm. Later, as they flew back to base in the pre-dawn darkness, Omar found her sitting alone in the back of the transport helicopter. Without a word, he sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. You okay? He asked quietly. Better than okay, Nur replied, flexing her left hand and watching the fingers respond normally. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Omar smiled in the darkness. We both are. They flew home in comfortable silence. 2 soldiers who had found something rare and precious, a love that made them stronger, not weaker, and a partnership that could survive anything the world threw at them. The truth, present-day Bahrain, the sun had moved higher in the sky. The joint training exercise continued around them, but something fundamental had shifted in the atmosphere. Commander Harrison stood awkwardly by the rope-climbing station, clearly wrestling with his assumptions and his words. Several of his SEALs looked embarrassed, while the international officers watched with a mixture of respect and vindication. Captain Nur al-Mansuri completed her modified exercises with clinical precision, demonstrating capabilities that far exceeded what most able-bodied soldiers could achieve. Her movements were economical, purposeful, and utterly professional. When she finished the last station, she walked back to where Harrison waited. Captain, he began, his voice stripped of its earlier arrogance. I owe you an apology. What I said was unprofessional and based on ignorance. Apology accepted, sir, Nur replied with the same calm dignity she had shown throughout the ordeal. We all make assumptions. The difference is whether we're willing to learn from them. Harrison nodded gratefully, then gestured toward the assembled troops. Would you be willing to address the teams? Share some of your operational experience. I think we could all learn something. Nur glanced across the field to where Omar stood with her unit. He gave her an almost imperceptible nod, not permission, but support. The choice was hers, as it always had been. Of course, sir. As she walked to the front of the assembled soldiers, Omar fell into step beside her. It wasn't planned or discussed. It was simply natural, the way they had moved together through training, through combat, through recovery, and through all the quiet moments in between. 3 years ago, I was convinced my career was over, Nur began, her voice carrying clearly across the training ground. I had been pulled from a burning vehicle by a fellow soldier who refused to follow orders to abandon me. The injuries were severe. The recovery was longer than expected, and everyone, including myself at times, questioned whether I could continue serving. She paused, looking out at the faces before her American SEALs, Jordanian Special Forces, officers from 6 different countries, all united in their commitment to something larger than themselves. What I learned during those months of rehabilitation is that strength isn't the absence of limitation. It's the refusal to let limitations define your potential. Partnership isn't about finding someone who makes up for your weaknesses. It's about finding someone who helps you discover strengths you didn't know you had. Omar remained silent beside her, but his presence spoke volumes. They had never needed grand declarations or public displays of affection. Their love was written in shared glances, in tactical trust, in the quiet moments when words weren't necessary. The sergeant who pulled me from that vehicle, Nur continued, never once treated me as if I was broken. He treated me as if I was healing. There's a difference, and it matters. After her brief remarks, the soldiers dispersed to continue their training. The Americans approached Omar and Nur with new respect, asking thoughtful questions about urban warfare tactics and injury rehabilitation. The crisis had transformed into an opportunity for genuine professional exchange. As the afternoon wound down, Omar and Nur found themselves alone for a moment by the equipment storage area, organizing gear for the next day's exercises. You didn't have to stand up there with me, Nur said quietly, checking radio batteries with methodical efficiency. Yes, I did, Omar replied simply. That's what partners do. Partners, she repeated, testing the word. They had never quite defined what they were to each other, even after all this time. In their world of structured hierarchies and professional boundaries, their relationship existed in the spaces between official categories. Is that what we are? She asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. Omar paused in his inventory of ammunition magazines, considering the question seriously. We're whatever we choose to be, he said finally, but we choose together. Nur smiled, a real smile that transformed her serious expression into something radiant. I can live with that. As they worked side by side in comfortable silence, organizing equipment and preparing for tomorrow's challenges, neither spoke about love or commitment or the future. They didn't need to. Love, in their world, wasn't something you declared, it was something you lived. Day by day, mission by mission, choice by choice, the desert wind picked up, stirring dust across the training compound. Somewhere in the distance, other soldiers continued their exercises, pushing themselves toward excellence, toward the kind of partnership and trust that could mean the difference between life and death. Omar and Nur finished their work as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new missions, new opportunities to prove that real love, didn't make soldiers weaker. It made them unstoppable.